Good day and welcome to our DEKRA EMC webinar for EMC automotive testing, especially today related to e-marking. Today's vehicles contain really a lot of technology. Think of electric vehicles, automated driving, think of connected vehicles. And connectivity is quickly becoming one of the factors which actually are distincting brands from different brands and distincting themselves from competition. This new technology gives many challenges, but also not only regarding safety, but also regarding EMC issues. And as these vehicles contain more and more electronics nowadays, these electronics also may emit RF noise, which has an effect, of course, on performance, but also perhaps on safety. To ensure that, electrical systems and components need to comply with regulatory EMC standards, which is not only important, but of course also mandatory. Today in this webinar, my colleague Juan Carlos Soler will tell you more about e-marking related to EMC testing, and especially also the EMC ECE Regulation 10 from that point of view. So let me introduce to you Juan Carlos Soler, Head of Technical Service Management and Vice President of the Product Testing Service Division from DEKRA. Juan Carlos, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vincent, for the introduction. Welcome everyone attending this session. So let's start with our topic for today, focused on EMC type approval of vehicles and components. This is a summary of the areas that we are going to cover today. After a brief introduction, we will start with the OEM requirements, continue with the general regulatory testing and type approval schemes. We will offer details of the approach followed in US, Europe, China, when we are looking at EMC at vehicle level. In topic number 5, we will pay attention to the EMC for electric and electronic sub-assemblies in Europe. Later, we will go through the US and after that with China. In the item number 8, we will start emphasizing the e-mark fundamentals and detail the type approval procedure for sub-assemblies. As a final approach, we will explain the Regulation 10 from UN ECE and describe the technical service submission process, ending the presentation with a quick summary stating why we believe that DEKRA is your best partner during any automotive homologation process. So let's go. In order to be able to place a product in the market, manufacturer of both components and vehicles need to comply not only with its own specific requirements, OEM, but also with the regulatory testing and homologation requirements, which are basically depending on the specific legal administrative framework. But it is important to notice that it is not enough to comply with the formal regulation. Fulfilling the OEM EMC requirement is a de facto condition to be able to sell components to the manufacturer of a vehicle. As already mentioned, vehicle manufacturers generally has its particular technical specs, which are not limited to EMC, but also they have, for instance, electrical and environmental requirements. In general, manufacturers are used to define specific test plans for testing and validation of products they want to integrate in the vehicles. These requirements are based on international standards as SAI, AIC, and CSPR, but personalized based on their years of experience and their particular vehicle conditions and behavior. Although it is not mandatory to fulfill those requirements to put a device in the market, this testing is required by OEM to ensure their desired safety of the final products. That is why, in general, severity levels required by OEM and testing complexity is much larger than the, allow me to say, formal regulatory requirements.
Juan Carlos, before you continue with the rest of your presentation, you indicate that the OEM requirements are stringent and more strict than the regulatory ones. You also explained that it has to do with the fact that it is validation and the validation cycle. Can you explain a little bit more why exactly that is, that they are more stringent, and can you give some examples of that? I think that's interesting to understand.
Well, in general, OEM focus, as you mentioned, not only in the testing of a product, but on the validation of it. And they need to be sure that the product will behave as expected and in a safe way inside their platforms, offering the highest level of confidence. To do that, their test plans are intensive. They generally require testing multiple samples instead of usual type testing, which is generally single sample, and increase the number of test complexity and the number of the test complexity. As a single example, could be radiated immunity testing, where ECE establishes a severity level between 24 to 30 volts per meter for components and vehicles, and within a specific frequency range with certain modulation. But most of the OEMs increase the frequency range, adding particular frequencies and modulation, for example, adding the radar frequency bands, and of course increasing the field over 80, 100, 200, and even more. Okay.
I think that's a good explanation from that. I also know that there is quite some time difference as well between UN R10 testing and the OEM requirements. Because if I understand correctly from you in a, let's say, earlier discussion, it's taking much longer to do the testing for the OEM requirements, right?
Absolutely. Actually, testing for regulatory requirements according to UNC can be normally finished within 1 day for a sub-assembly. But if we are talking about an OEM specification for that same sub-assembly, it may take several weeks.
So actually, it's safe to say that, let's say, once they pass the regulatory, once they pass the OEM specs, then let's say the regular part is probably, I wouldn't say easy, but let's say less of a difficulty than the OEM specs. Okay, thanks for that, Juan Carlos.
My pleasure. Okay, let's now get a little dive into the regulatory testing and type approval. We have to make here a distinction into first, vehicle and components, and a second level of granularity, which is added by the inclusion or not of wireless into the equation. In general, for vehicle and non-wireless sub-assemblies, we find two different approaches. Markets, where self-certification is allowed and no third party is involved, as is the case of US and Canada, and markets which are based on homologation and requires authorized technical services at DEKRA that, as in this case, we have Europe, China, or even India. Why I made a distinction for wireless sub-assemblies? Because in this particular case, additional requirements may apply depending on the product characteristics and the country regulation. We will talk about that a little bit more in detail later. In general, we could say that EMC regulatory testing and type approval for vehicles and sub-assemblies is provided by UN ECE Regulation 10. But, of course, there are different requirements and local regulations which are applicable too. Let's get deeper into EMC requirements for vehicles in Europe, US, and China. So, starting with Europe. Well, actually, Europe and the 56 countries, including UN ECE agreements, require EMARC homologation process. And for that, a technical service, as already mentioned, is needed to grant the compliance of R10, Regulation 10, that allows manufacturer to label the product with the EMARC symbol and the code to place the product in the market. In the US, you found a market that is based on self-certification. Here, another distinction is needed because electric vehicles are included under the scope of FCC Part 15 Subpart B, and compliance must be sure. But for electronic components and internal combustion engine vehicles and non-plug-in hybrids, they are exempt from compliance with FCC requirements. In mainland China, there is a similar scheme comparable to EMARC. This is the CCC, China Compulsory Certification, that is equivalent to Regulation 10 from UN ECE, although it is worth to say that there are some specific recommended standards covering electromagnetic emissions and human exposure for electric vehicles. Now let's focus on EMC for sub-assemblies. We will start with the requirements in Europe. It is important to highlight that for aftermarket products, no type approval is formally required, although CE mark, according to the EMC directive, is applicable. Here, you can see the product family standard for aftermarket electronic components to be installed in vehicles, which is the EN 5498. For what we call before market products, I mean those that will be installed in the vehicle before being placed in the market, in the OEM manufacturing process, type approval is required, and EMARC regulation applies. And in particular, EMC standard is the UN ECE Regulation 10, as already mentioned. Under this approval, the homologation can be granted on a component level, allowing the use in every vehicle under certain installation conditions, of course. Or it can also be granted as a separate technical unit, which only allow the use in a specific type of vehicle. An example of this can be warning lights. Warning lights can only be installed in a police vehicles, for example, but not in a normal vehicle. It is important to highlight here that products, including wireless communication functions, are subject to radio equipment directive and not the directive. Okay? So let's move now to the US. In this case, FCC Part 15 testing should apply following a self-declaration of conformity procedure, but digital devices exclusively used for transportation vehicles, including motor vehicles and aircraft, are exempt. Having said that, following the guidance of FCC, DEKRA highly recommend testing products according to FCC Part 15, 107 and 109 to ensure compliance with the technical standards. And please remember that if a product contains any wireless communication function, then another FCC part may apply depending on the product technical specification. Finally, in this quick world tour, we go to China. Okay, when it comes to sub-assemblies, there is no need to get the CCC. There is no mandatory requirements, and the requirements are granted by the OEM specification. You may say here a list of standards from different OEMs as Great Wall, Geely, BMW, Volkswagen, Ford, and also a reference link if you are interested to see the local regulation. This is in Chinese, of course. As a last warning, again, products containing wireless function, here SRRC certification is needed, depending on the product technical specification. SRRC is actually the State Radio Monitoring and Testing Center that basically provides a similar certification to CCC, but for wireless products. But China has some additional particularities. So let's talk about the EMC requirements for electric vehicles. Here, there is a mandatory EMC testing and certification process to get the CCC according to GB 34660. This is applicable to Class M, N, and vehicles and Class O trailers that are used on highways and urban roads in China. This is not applicable to low-speed vehicles, vehicles running on tracks, agriculture and forestry tractors, or even construction machinery. It is also worth to mention that there is some specific requirements for e-bikes and scooters, which also have a compulsory product certification, in this case, the CCC, but according to TV 17761. But allow us now to focus on e-mark. In order to show EMC compliance with UN ECE regulation, manufacturers need to follow the type approval process for e-mark. UN ECE Working Party 29 is a unique worldwide regulatory forum inside the UNC Inland Transport Committee and governs provision for vehicles and their system and parts related to safety and environmental aspects, as well as energy and anti-theft. Here we find performance-oriented testing requirements and for sure administrative procedures that address the type approval, the conformity production, and the mutual recognition is granted by the contracted parties. Currently, there are 56 countries inside UNC agreements, but not all of them has its own country code. Here you may find a list of the available country codes so far, but due to the mutual recognition agreement, actually, all e-mark are acknowledgeable. I have highlighted a few country codes, the German, the Dutch, and the Ireland ones, all, by the way, provided by DEKRA, which certainly have a very well-known prestige. But again, they all fulfill the same objective, to allow proper placement of automotive parts and vehicles in the market. Here, you may see some examples of the e-mark symbol and codes, and a quick explanation of what the numbers means. In the case of both single regulation, the first one is R10, and multiple regulation where R10 and R33 are applied. In the past, Europe had its own type approval process, e-mark with an E lowercase, and it was associated also to a technical service to manage the type approval. But Regulation 661 in 2009, long time ago already, trying to reduce the administrative burden for manufacturers that usually had to go to both the capital E and the lowercase e type approval, established UN ECE regulations as mandatory in Europe, simplifying the type approval process to only the capital E. Okay. Now, how do you know if your specific product shall go to e-mark type approval process? Testing and homologation? Well, for EMC Regulation 10, which is applicable to vehicles categories L, M, N, O, T, R, and S, includes a flowchart to help and solve the applicability questions for electronic sub-assemblies. Here you can have a look at it. It's rather easy to follow, and I won't go through it.
Juan Carlos, you indicate the ECE R10 process in the flowchart. Like I said in my introduction, a lot of new changes are coming up as well. And you also mentioned about connected vehicles. You were talking also about vehicles with connectivity in it, electric vehicles. So a lot of technical changes. Can you explain how we as DEKRA are involved in the ECE regulations and what's coming ahead of us on that?
Okay, sure. DEKRA has a network of laboratories and testing experts covering worldwide. And we attend national and international committees to keep track and also to contribute during standard developments. In this particular case, we participate in the EMC task force inside the UN ECE meetings. Currently, we are working in the future revision 7 for the Regulation 10, which is expected to have a final proposal available by the end of the next year, hopefully October 2022.
Thanks for that, Juan Carlos. And I think it's also good to emphasize to our viewers how we as DEKRA are involved, not only in applying the current regulation, but also how we try to follow what's coming ahead of us and also make sure that the technology which is developing constantly can be tested and can be also certified later on. So thanks for that. Please continue.
Sure. Now we will further explain the type approval process to get the EMC mark for electric and electronic sub-assemblies. Before going into the details, we have to explain that a product can get the type approval inside a vehicle while the vehicle is being homologated, right? But then it will only be homologated for that particular vehicle. So in general, manufacturers of sub-assemblies tend to approve their devices before its integration on the vehicle as a type, and then it can be used in different vehicles. What shall manufacturers do? First, complete the testing successfully, of course, according to UN ECE Regulation 10. Current version, as already mentioned, is version number 6 with amendment number 1. Then the manufacturer shall apply for a technical service to review, and after the successful review and approval from the technical service, the later will provide a homologation number, and it shall be affixed by the manufacturer into the device with any mark on the subassembly. Okay. After that, the product is allowed to be installed in the vehicles, but please take into account that manufacturers shall maintain the proper conformity of production and as long as the product is being manufactured. And what is that conformity of production? COP is a pillar for the international agreement, and approval authorities are mandated to ensure that UNECE type approval are granted to manufacturers that show the ability to produce every vehicle or subassembly as they approve it. Approval authorities is only possible after the review and acceptance of the COP. In general, to get the approval from the authority for the COP, a quality management system, ISO, IATF, the International Automotive Task Force, is highly recommended. Authorities can assess the quality system, their procedures, and the manufacturing plants, but what it is a must is the product conformity arrangement, where the manufacturer arrange and document the control plan and for each approval. Meaning that yearly testing is required for the product manufacturer in order to ensure the maintenance of the compliance of the EMC requirements, including in Regulation 10 during the full life product cycle. Now, let's get a bit more details from the testing part of the type approval. Typically, products are tested to verify the fulfillment of emission and immunity, according to EMC. Emission of radiated broad and narrow band, and also transients for the related immunity functions are applicable. Also, susceptibility testing can be radiated and or conducted, covering the frequency range from 20 to 2000 megahertz. There are some exceptions that reduce or even increase the amount of testing required. For example, sub-assemblies that do not include an electronic oscillator with operation frequency larger than 9K are deemed to comply with narrowband emission. Products with no immunity-related functions needed to be tested to radiate disturbance, but rechargeable electric energy storage systems have additional requirements, as they are connected to power mains, so harmonics, flicker, conducted emission, and fast transients, etc., are really required. We're getting close to the end of the presentation, so now let's comment the submission process with the technical service. Okay. Here we are describing all the information that a manufacturer shall provide to the technical service when submitting an application. Obviously, the application form, which is the formal request for the type approval. It is also required to provide authorization of registration to allow the register of the approval in the technical service database of manufacturers. The conformity of production is required, as already mentioned, the COP agreement, the internal procedures, records, templates, a copy of the quality management certificates, or at least a positive initial assessment for every production site. Okay, this, together with the technical dossier for the product, including the full description of the product, marking, restriction of usage, rating, mechanical and electrical drawing, and of course, last and not least, the test report according to UNCE Regulation 10 from a technical service approved laboratory. And that's all. And how can DEKRA help? Well, we believe that we are your best partner for helping you to place your products in the market in a faster and reliable way. We can support you with our independent type approval team in the process to prepare the documents required to submit the application to the technical service. We can perform testing according to Regulation 10 in your local DEKRA laboratory. And we are a technical service under Regulation 10, many more. And we can be your partner to perform testing of conformity of production arrangement. And all of that with a single point of contact. So do not hesitate to contact us in case you have any testing and or type approval need.
Thanks, Juan Carlos, for this comprehensive overview in EMC automotive testing, especially the deep dive you did on the ECE regulation R10. We were talking earlier together also about connected car, electric vehicles, automated driving, things like that. Lots of new developments. What developments do you see in future that will impact the EMC and testing and certification, especially related to R10?
It is true. I mean, technology is usually well ahead of the standardization process. Right now, inside the Regulation 10, we are discussing what to test for eCall functionalities. That has been recently a hot topic, right? But most of the challenges will come through the exponential growth expected in connected driving, autonomous driving, or in general mobility. Okay.
Thanks for that, and I think it's a fair comment as well. Final question, what's your advice for manufacturers who wants to go through testing and certification for EMC Automotive?
It is actually great you mentioned that. Our best advice is not to let the type approval as the last topic to cover. It is highly recommended to consider the need to complete type approval since the beginning. Designing the product in order to achieve compliance with UNCE requirements. Doing pre-testing is in general a good idea. And this, combined with the preparation of the proper documentation linked to the product and considering the appropriate quality assurance procedures in the early stage of the product life cycle, will make the homologation process much more efficient and will avoid last-minute time pressure.
Thanks for that, and let me add to that as well that we know from experience that, let's say, the sooner you test with pre-testing, it also has a beneficial effect on the cost, because if you have to correct something at the end of the development process, the costs are huge compared to earlier. So I think it's a good advice, Juan Carlos. The earlier the better you start with pre-testing, the better it is, not only for the regulatory, for the homologation, but also for from an efficiency and a cost point of view. Thanks very much for this presentation, and thank you for watching.